More than usual because I'm getting old and I need prayer more than I used to. That is, I feel the need of it. And I don't advise you getting old and get so you can't drive at night and other problems. But you didn't ask for my discussion of my health. I mentioned yesterday I wanted to review a book that had been sent to me. And I have several pages of notes about that book. I doubt I'll be able to finish them this morning. So if I don't, I will by tomorrow morning. You tell me, Brother A, what time to quit. Why? The book is entitled An In-Depth Study of Marriage and Divorce by John Edwards of St. Louis, good friend of mine. I think so much of him personally. I've been in his home, been a guest in his home. I've preached there. Now, his brother Earl is a professor at Freed-Hardeman College, and I asked Earl about John's new book. He said, I do not agree with it. So I was rejoicing to hear that. First is that John is a man of sympathy. He has seen many problems in divorce cases and marriages that are not happy. And building off of that, somehow it came to his mind that he says the traditional way of dealing with marriage and divorce just can't be right. So he's tried to delve into find some other explanation than the simple teachings of Jesus in this regard. All of us need to have sympathy for those in trouble, but you and I didn't write the Bible. And in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and in him are all the treasures of wisdom, not in us. So he knows what's best. Immediately he begins to tell us that we need to study the Greek in order to understand his new viewpoint. Well, that is a confession that the simple English Bible teaches something that he doesn't believe. And it also is a reflection on the fact that God has made this subject so difficult. You need to be a linguist. You need to know Greek in order to understand the simple teaching of marriage and divorce. I don't buy that doctrine. Anyone that says you need to know Greek to understand simply how to live with your wife is not a Bible doctrine. Now, anyone that has the privilege of studying Greek is blessed, but nobody needs to know it to know what to do to be saved. The Great Commission, all nations, Jesus envisioned the Bible in every language. And we rejoice that the American Bible Society is working hard in that direction. So we don't need those languages in order to know how to live with husband and wife. Further on, I'll mention too, he abandons the Greek and goes to the German. And that makes it even more difficult for us who do not know foreign languages well enough to dig into them. And we don't need to. But immediately he makes a mistake in his Greek as he starts out. Quote, he says that the aorist is always punctiliar or point action. Now, he's not the first Greek scholar who's made that mistake, but it is a mistake. Let me try to point out just exactly what the aorist is, because we can see it in the letters. There is a Greek word that looks like this. And it's spelled out H, that's an H, H-O-R-I-G-Z-O. Horizo. It means to set a boundary, to set the limits for something. But the Greeks, when they wanted to negate something, oftentimes just put an alpha and a in front of it. So it's alpha primitive, they call it. Alpha primitive plus horizo. And you put the A in front of it, and you have the A-O-R-I-D-Z-O. Horizo, don't set the boundary. No limits on it. You can't specify this point action, durative action, any other kind of, there's no limits on it. It doesn't tell you the kind of action yours does. It just says an act. An act either has happened, is happening, or will happen. An act that doesn't tell you what kind of action is there. And you can see the English word A-O-R-I-S-T coming out of horizo. So he's wrong on his beginning point there. Now, punctiliar point action. For the present tense, that's what he's talking about in this. It's Matthew 19:9. More, that word I put up there yesterday. Moi kata. That's M-O-I-C-H-A-T-A-I, which is present tense, indicative mood, third person singular, middle or passive, and being middle, he commits adultery. Or to use the obsolete expression to carry over the verb form completely, he adulterizes. Now, every common person reading that and puts away his wife in a reason except fornication, commits adultery. Sees the picture that now he's entered into a new marriage relationship. As long as he's in it, he keeps on committing adultery. That's the simple teaching, but he doesn't want to go with that. So he says the keeps on idea isn't there, that we back it up to point action. Now the grammarians do know about a point action, which they illustrate simply by a dot. The durative action by a straight line, keeps on. And this, of course, is just simply the keeps on idea. As long as he's in that situation, he keeps on committing adultery. But our brother backs up and says, point action is what is here. Well, let's see now. Occasionally there is point action in present tense, one will have to admit. But the context has to tell you if it's there. Context here rules it out. But let me give an example. Hard to find point action in present tense. But you see it in Matthew 27:38. Then they staruntai, then they crucified two thieves with him. Now they didn't keep on doing that just one time. Just point action. So that is an example of it, but they're very rare. Nearly every present tense is a keeping on idea, such as the durative idea, such as in Matthew 25:8. The context tells you, point action or durative, give us of your oil for our lamps. savenunta, are going out. Process, durative. They didn't go out instantaneously. Or John 5:7. I have no one when the water is stirred to put me in the pool for a while, eukomai, for while I am coming. Somebody steps in the way. Durative action. Not just one step, but it's durative, walking along. All right? And really there is another kind of present tense action which he doesn't mention. This is point action, adopt. This is durative action. Stretched out, keeping on idea. But then there is one that can be illustrated this way. A series of dots, repetitive action. And that specifically is what we have in Matthew 19:9, Matthew 5:32. Repetitive action. Because the act of adultery in that second marriage is not continuous, but it's repetitive over and over again. See, the context tells you and the nature of the verb tells you what kind of action is there. So you'd have to pin that down as repetitive action. What? But he thinks by eliminating these two, he doesn't mention this one, by eliminating the durative and restrict this to the point action, then the very moment that this man with the second woman stands up before a justice of the peace, I hope no gospel preacher would let himself stand there. He stands up before the justice of the peace, having his divorce paper, now his marriage license, and then the justice says, now I pronounce you husband and wife. At that time, according to our brother, adultery has been committed. Point action. Two legal ceremonies. Before he even kisses the bride. That's point action. But of course, it is ridiculous. Then he says, now after they've been pronounced husband and wife, they've committed adultery in those two legal ceremonies, but now he goes home with his second wife and has sexual relations with her, and that's not adultery, he says. For they're legally married, and married couples are supposed to have intercourse, and if they deprive each other, they're sinning. They should have marriage relations after they are legally married, and that's not adultery, he says. The adultery was simply the two legal ceremonies. That makes our Lord very ridiculous. Now, he uses a chart from Olin Hicks. Olin Hicks had a great debate with Jim Waldron. If you don't know Jim, you've missed a great treasure. Wish we could have him on this lectureship. They had a debate about this subject, and he used a chart, he says is taken from Olin Hicks in that debate, in 3 steps. 3 steps. 1, if a man puts away his wife, if you can't read this, I don't have time to teach you to read. That's what J.D. Finch said. I could do better if I had more time. If a man puts away his wife, except for fornication, that's step number 1. Number 2, and shall marry another. Step number 2. Number 3, commits adultery. All right? Olin Hicks. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly what the Bible teaches. But the St. Louis brother reverses 2 and 3 in his new doctrine. He says if a man puts away his wife except fornication, at that point he commits adultery. Whether he ever gets married again or not. He changes the wording of step 3. But if he goes on marriage, the adultery has already been committed at this stage. Commits adultery. He reverses 2 and 3. Now that's comparable to the way Baptists reverse steps 2 and 3, Mark 16:16. All gospel preachers have used this. He that believeth, step number 1, and is baptized, step number 2, shall be saved, step number 3. But the Baptists reverse 2 and 3. He that believeth, step number 1, is saved, step number 3, and should be baptized, step number 2. Reversing 2 and 3. And that's exactly what our brother does about Olin Hicks' chart. Now, the common man, not knowing Greek, still thinks Jesus was saying every man who swaps wives, except for fornication, becomes an adulterer and keeps on committing adultery until he repents and leaves that second connection. So it's certainly durative for the duration, as long as that second marriage lasts. But more technically, it is repetitive or iterative action. A big word that the grammarians use about it, but we understand repetitive better. Iterative or repetitive action. Then our brother quotes from the Lutheran scholar Linsky over and over. And I was surprised he gives this quote from Linsky about the statement that he that marries a divorcee commits adultery. Linsky says it's durative. I was surprised, just the opposite of what John's been teaching. Quote Linsky, he, the man who marries a divorcee, a put-away woman, he constantly bears the stigma, constantly. And as long as the two live together, the shadow will follow them. Not one act, not punctiliar. That's durative. Continuous relations. All right? Then our brother says, as some of our other brothers do, that there's no such thing as living in adultery. I don't know why anyone would say that. I've listed here several passages have the word live in it. Romans 6:2. How shall we who have died to sin live any longer therein? Romans 8:13. If ye live after the flesh, living in a situation. Ephesians 2:3, among whom we all had our conversation in the lust of the flesh when we lived in them. Colossians 3:7, wherein you once walked when you lived in these things. From verse 5, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desires. Titus 3:3, living in malice and envy. 1 Peter 4:2, that ye should no longer live the rest of your time in the flesh to the lusts of men. Then our brother brings up another non-dictionary meaning of adultery. First, these two legal ceremonies. But he brings up another definition. He said that anything other than fornication that violates the marriage agreement is adultery. Just being mean to your wife, mean to your husband, being disagreeable, incompatible, that is adultery, whether you ever get a divorce or not. It's a breaking of the marriage vows to hold together and to love and to cherish until death does part. He says that is adultery. Now he resorts to the German to prove this. The covenant of marriage he talks about a great deal, which is a good expression. Linsky says the phrase in the English Bibles, he commits adultery, that we've gone over several times, is not adequate. He commits adultery. Quoted from Jesus, at McCord. That's the English translation. Linsky says that is not an adequate translation. So what does he do about it? He goes to the German and gives it this way. He says the verb is EHEBRECHEN. German word, and he says it means ruins marriage. Ruins marriage. And he says that's what Jesus is saying. And he puts away his wife's fornication, ruins marriage. Well, he does, but that wasn't what Jesus was saying. Now you check into this. The German verb, ECHEN, does mean to ruin. The dictionary says it means to break, to cut, to crush. So he's used the word ruin. And the Germans, when the noun is formed, always use a capital E, the EHE in front of it. That's the German word for marriage. So he breaks marriage. He ruins marriage. Well, that is a good grammatical discussion of the German word. But Jesus wasn't a German. And he didn't talk German. So Professor Linsky is going he tries to go to the Greek, now the German, now satisfied with the English. Then he makes another attempt. He goes next to the Old Testament to justify the breaking of a covenant. So that's all adultery is. Jeremiah 3:8, backsliding Israel had committed adultery. Now it's true that committing adultery there is not necessarily physical. It's worship of idols. Oftentimes in the worship of idols, they did have their sacred prostitutes at the temple, and they did commit adultery, but that's not the point. Sometimes they didn't. All Jeremiah's condemning is they were supposed to be married to God, and then they quit him and married Baal, foreign god. And that's called adultery, taken over from the marriage relationship, but it's figurative adultery, not literal adultery. But our brother uses that to try to bring it over to you and me, that if you're not nice to your wife or your husband, you have broken the marriage vow. Now, James 4, verse 4, used this same idea in the New Testament. You adulterers and adulteresses, not friends of God. When Christians apostatize, they're said to be adulterizing. But it's not necessarily physical. Any break away from the faith of the New Testament, James is calling adultery. Now, I've counted the list, and you check me out. Jesus speaks of physical adultery 14 times. I'll not take the time to give the citations. He speaks of mental adultery one time. Matthew 5:28. Has committed adultery with her in his heart. Mental adultery. Jesus speaks of figurative adultery 3 times. Not the physical. For example, Matthew 12:39. An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign. The context indicates he's not talking about physical adultery, but faithless people, not dependable. There's evil and faithless generation. All right? But none of those are the only 3 meanings I believe you can find in the New Testament for this word. And yet he's given us 2 other definitions of adultery. Now, unless qualified, the word adultery means nothing more than the plain dictionary definition of it, a violation of the marriage bed. That's what the dictionary says. And that's the usual meaning, unless it means, if it has any other meaning, the context has to show it. So we better leave it that way. And so 14 times, I believe we'd have to say that on Jesus' lips. One time he didn't mean physical, the mental. 3 times he used it in a figurative way. In Jesus' eyes, a person's becoming one flesh with a non-spouse is the only reason to break up a home and to start another one. 1 Corinthians 6:16, Matthew 19:9. Now, separations may regrettably occur and sometimes necessarily occur. 1 Corinthians 7:11. But no remarriage. Remain unmarried, or else be reconciled. So there's just one reason that God thinks is bad enough to break up a marriage and start another one while the first companion is yet living. Then our brother criticizes the King James use of the active voice in Matthew 5:32, and he has a good point there. He says the King James has changed the passive to an active. Whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, making her active in the process, causes her to commit adultery. Well, Jesus didn't say that. It is passive there in the Greek, as our brother points out. It is the first aorist passive infinitive, moikuthena. Now, what does it say? Literally causes her to be adulterized. That's the literal of it. The dictionary says adulterize is an archaic, obsolete word, but that's the literal of it. A man that mistreats his wife that way, she's innocent, still as pure as she can be, but this no good husband causes her, by divorcing her, he causes her to be adulterized. Thayer says to be debauched. And that's a good way to put it. She's been debauched. Though she did not commit adultery, she is left as though she had done so. She's left exposed. She's been victimized, and her virginity is gone forever. She's been mistreated. Makes her an adulteress. That is, it looks like that way. Really not. Now, I've heard the explanation that what Jesus meant by that was that potentially he makes her an adulteress because she is put on, she's out free again, she may commit adultery. Potentially she becomes an adulteress. Well, that's true, but that's not what Jesus said. He used the past tense. She already has been debauched, victimized. What she'll do in the future, he doesn't discuss. So that's a good thought, that potentially she will be. Yes, that's true. But Jesus used the past tense. She already has experienced this. She's exposed and embarrassed for what that guy's put her through. All right? And whereas my friend will criticize the King James for making a passive verb into an active translation, he also makes the verb McCord passive when it should be middle. Now, of course, the Greek form is either way. You have to tell by the context whether it's middle or passive. And if it's passive, it gives the wrong thought. But he tries to make it passive, that he who marries her that's been released, and he quotes from Linsky to make it passive, is stigmatized as an adulteress. No, as adulterous. He is stigmatized, that's passive. It's been done to him. So Linsky, my brother, trying to point out that the guilt is not on the man that's marrying the second wife. The passive idea indicates that it's not a sin he commits, but the sin was committed by the first man in driving her out. Well, the passive idea just trying to remove the guilt from that man. Each of you that has studied Greek knows that the middle voice is also possible. The context has to tell you. And the middle voice is always active. One acts in regard to himself, the middle voice. Yes, please. Has to have to quit? 5 minutes. All right, thank you, sir. And that's true. He acts in regard to himself. The man who puts away his wife and marries another, or the man who marries a divorcee, commits adultery. It's active. It's something he does, and he does it in regard to himself, because it also affects others. But all the verb is saying he does it in regard to himself. It's middle voice. And confirmatory of that is Luke 16:18, where Luke uses not the middle, but the active voice. Markui, whosoever marrieth her that is put away from her husband, committeth adultery, active. So that has to be the way of it in Matthew 5, as well as then confirmed by Luke 16. Now, he misuses 1 Corinthians 7:24, Romans 7:3, and many other passages about Herodias and Herod guilty of incest. That's not so. And I'll have to take time for that tomorrow, though, but that be. Let me just say something about 1 Corinthians 7:15. He misuses that. He and Linsky say that if the unbeliever depart, let him depart. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. He says then, the brother or sister who's been left is now free to marry without any guilt. A remarriage privilege. Both of them are affirming that. That isn't so. Now let's examine that verse. This verse is not a Pauline remarriage privilege. It's a Pauline release from an obligation. That's all that's there textually. is not under bondage or obligation. Sometimes brethren have backed up from the meaning of this Greek word doulo. And I haven't seen all that's possible there, and I think I've gotten into a wrong interpretation of it. You check me out. This is the Greek word that Paul uses there, doulo. D-O-U-L-O-O. Doulo. What does it mean? To be enslaved is one meaning. All right? To be enslaved. So if someone says that this innocent wife has never been enslaved to a fellow like that at any time, that's not what Paul's talking about. There is another way this word is used. And the lexicon says it also means this: to become devoted to the services of. To become devoted to the service, and gives two scriptural uses that way. Romans 6:17, God be thanked that though you were sinners of sin, ye have obeyed in the heart that form of doctrine, and then being made free from sin, ye became servants of righteousness. Nothing servile about it. Voluntary service. You took it on yourself. Same way in verse 22, servants of God. Romans 1:1, Paul, a doulos of Jesus Christ, slave of God, slave of Jesus Christ. But it's not servile bondage. It's willing service. And that's exactly the way with this innocent one. Back in 1 Corinthians 7, 1-5, she has no more power over her body, neither does he over his own. She is in service, he is in service, their bodies belong to each other, but it's not a servile bondage. It's a willing, loving service. They want it that way, just as Paul wanted to be a servant of Christ. Now, when the unbeliever departs, the brother or sister is not under that obligation anymore to hold that home together. She's done her best. If he walks out, she cannot carry out that obligation, marriage obligation, to him anymore. In such cases, mark that phrase. Now, she has been in that obligation since the day she married, and would till he dies if he stays with her. But in such cases as abandonment, it's not possible anymore. And God says she doesn't have to blame herself if she did her best to be a good, warm wife. But God has called us to peace. He has to try to keep that home together. He doesn't want it broken up. He doesn't want you to run that fellow off. But if in spite of all that you do, he runs off anyway, don't blame yourself if you've been what you should. God won't hold you responsible to break up that home. In such cases, but in other cases, normal cases, you are in that willing service to your husband or your wife, both of you. More tomorrow morning, the Lord willing. But that's far, regardless of that interpretation, that's far from saying she's got a right to go marry again. That's what's added to the text by our brother.